image comes to mind when you think about God's creation? Do you think big, like a forest, maybe stars or galaxies? What about weather events? Now, what about something small like a beetle or a butterfly? We invite you to think about God's creation from many different angles. Try thinking of yourself as a small insect pollinating a beautiful flower. How does that feel? And now think of yourself as a huge oak tree, giving shelter to birds and animals and shade to friends on a picnic. How cool is that? And that little journey is just a glimpse into the impetus for this video series, the feeling of interconnectedness with all other life forms on Mother Earth. We're calling this video series Connected in God's Creation, and we're exploring ways of responding to God's call to care for creation. We acknowledge the mess we have made and allowed to continue for far too long, and we need to be part of the solution. If you'd like to record your thoughts as you listen to this material, please feel free to pause the video and get something to take notes with. Welcome back. This series was created by Lutherans and Episcopalians in the Delaware and Maryland area who are eager to share the vision, the wisdom, and the call to action that is the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter was crafted by visionaries with input from thousands of individuals and organizations around the world almost 22 years ago. This is a picture of it on my kitchen counter. And while it is only 4 pages long, albeit very small font, it is huge in its intent. It was written for the collective we. It is a secular document, but it is in lockstep with the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and all of Jesus Christ's teachings. And it has been endorsed by the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the Episcopal Church, and many, many other religions around the world. The Earth Charter's goal is to inspire a sense of responsibility for all beings, regardless of their importance to humans, for creatures now and importantly, in the future. The Earth Charter is intended for all individuals, organizations, both for-profit and non-profit, and governments. There's no one left out of its intentions. It offers a recipe for successful living on Mother Earth. It reminds humans that while we are not more important than trees or waterways or kangaroos or butterflies, we do have an outsized impact on other life forms. And our ways need to change if humans are going to exist for longer than just a few more generations. The Earth Charter has 61 objectives, which are grouped into 16 principles and further grouped into 4 pillars, which we will list now. Number 1, we must respect and care for all plants, animals, and people. Number 2, we must strive for ecological integrity. Number 3, we need social and economic justice. And number 4, we have an imperative to strive for democracy, nonviolence, and peace. This video will cover aspects of the 4th pillar, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. Please enjoy.
Well, welcome. I am the Reverend Dellynne Hinton of Glen Oak and Arlington Lewin United Methodist Churches, but I am also the chair of Central Maryland Ecumenical Council. Our mission is to make the beloved community real, and we have started on our way towards that endeavor. And in doing that, we are considering the Kingian philosophies and determining what part of that we can do. As we continue to work in that area, we continue to look at the principles and the skills that are necessary to do that work. So we're excited about having you with us today as we consider the philosophies as presented by Kazu Hagar. We look forward to your participation.
I am Gary Gillespie. I am former executive director of Central Maryland Ecumenical Council and a member of the board and a member of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers. One part of the Kingian philosophy that was organized by Dr. Bernard Lafayette. Dr. Lafayette was inspired by the last words of Dr. King to him, that nonviolence needs to be institutionalized and internationalized.
In our efforts to do that, we are providing training and constant participation in activities that cause us to think a little bit further about not just learning about Kingian nonviolence, but actually practicing the principles. One of the things that Hagar puts forward is that our concern for nonviolence is not just merely person to person, but it is about how we relate to our environment and how our environment relates to us. That all of creation needs to be a part of being nonviolent, that this is not about an incident in which we do not have violence, but rather living a lifestyle that is conducive to procreation, sustainability, and the renewal of all of our resources in such a way that we are not harming the environment that we're in, nor is the environment harmful to us.
The other piece in terms of the charter, the practice of nonviolence and peace building is an important part of the charter. And the training that comes out of Kingian nonviolence, to quote Kazu Haga, helps develop our spiritual muscle to create a peaceful world, a nonviolent world, a safe world for all people.
Also, this is not something that we learn in a classroom environment, but rather it is something that we have to practice on a daily basis in our interpersonal relationships and how we operate within the world, so that when we find ourselves in a particularly aggressive, violent situation, it's not something that we have to think about, but a muscle that we have been working on, and we automatically respond with nonviolence. We invite you to take a moment to look at the 6 principles as presented by Kazu Haga and have a chance to really analyze them and figure out how they work in your life, because all of the principles are there and are available to each and every one of us to use on a daily basis. It is necessary, if we want to live in a nonviolent society, to consider these principles. So we invite you at this time. This is something that you need to consider in your daily activities and how you relate interpersonally. So take this time to consider the principles.
The first principle of Kingian nonviolence is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And it speaks to the idea that nonviolence is not a passive thing, that it's a proactive thing. I think a lot of us have seen fights break out in our own communities, and oftentimes you'll see a group of people just gather around to watch. Those people who are just gathering around to watch are being not violent, right? I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about nonviolence is all it means to be nonviolent is to be not violent. But all those people who gather around and watch the violence in our communities and don't do anything about it, they're being not violent. So Dr. King, the way he understood nonviolence was it wasn't just about not being violent, but it was about taking a stand against violence. And when you live in a community and in a society that is so filled with violence, it takes incredible courage to be the one to stand up and call for peace. And you watch videos and footage from the civil rights movement, and you see all those students and all those young people go out into the streets knowing that they might get beaten, knowing that they might get hosed, knowing that they might get bitten by dogs, and going out there anyways. That's what it means to be nonviolent, and that takes an incredible amount of courage. So that's the first principle that we always talk about, is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It's not just a tactic, but it's a way of life, and it's how we interact with the world, and making a commitment to always take a stand against violence, to always take a stand against injustice. Principle number 2 is the beloved community is the framework of the future. The beloved community is the idea, is the vision for the society that Dr. King was working towards. And it's a society that includes justice for all people. So in that context, even the framing of the Occupy movement about the 99% and the 1%, as brilliant as that framing was, because it brought so many people and so many communities and so many issues together, ultimately, I don't think it's a framing that Dr. King would have supported, because Dr. King's vision of the beloved community included 100% of humanity. Dr. King always said about segregation that segregation wasn't an issue between black people and white people, but it was an issue between justice and injustice. And similarly, the issues that the Occupy movement was trying to address is not an issue between the 99% and the 1%, but it's an issue between what's right and what's wrong. And so what we're trying to do is create a community, the beloved community, that includes equitable relationships between all people, where we haven't defeated our opponent, but we've won our opponent over. And it's a framework for the future, because Dr. King understood that, again, that vision of the beloved community isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something that we needed to be committed to in a long-term way. And that concept of the beloved community, sometimes people describe it as Dr. King's vision of utopia. And utopia isn't something that we're ever going to be able to create, right? We're never going to be able to live in a world that's entirely free of violence. But if we don't aim for that, we're definitely not going to get anywhere close to it. So as absurd as it is to envision a world without violence, if that's our beloved community, if that's the vision of the society that we're trying to create, that will ensure that we'll get as close to it as possible. So to me, whether that vision that you have for the society that you want to create is possible or not, whether it's realistic or not, this principle talks about the need to dream big so that we can get as close to that vision as we can in our lifetime. The third principle of Kingian nonviolence is attack forces of evil and not persons doing evil. This is one of the most challenging principles, I think, to practice in our own lives and in our movements, because we're so used to attacking people and we're so used to attacking individuals. During the Oscar Grant movement, we attacked Johannes Messerle as if he was the problem. During George Bush's presidency, we attacked him as if he was the problem. But recognizing that there's always a history to those conflicts and that there's always systemic reasons of why these people do what they do. Essentially, Johannes Messerle did what he was trained to do. George Bush did what he was trained to do. There's reasons why we continue to have police brutality and why we continue to have politicians that aren't fighting for the people. And it's because there's systemic issues behind that. And so Dr. King was always good at recognizing the root causes of a conflict and not attacking the people, but attacking those sources, attacking the root problems or the root causes of the problems. And so that's what this principle speaks to, is being able to identify why things are the way they are and not just looking at the symptoms of the problem, but really addressing the root causes of the problems in our society. Principle number 4 is accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve a goal. This applies in any, whether it's social movements or interpersonally. Anyone who's ever played a sport understands the importance of this principle. That if your goal is to become the best athlete that you can be, then you're going to need to voluntarily accept a lot of suffering in order to get there. If your goal is to go to college, you might have to skip out on some parties and sit home and do homework, and that creates some suffering. It's not easy, but recognizing that if you have a goal in mind, that volunteering yourself for some sacrifice, for some suffering, can be redemptive and it can help you grow. And also recognizing that voluntarily accepting that suffering in the context of social movements, again, it paints a very clear picture of who's right and who's wrong. When you're facing police violence and state repression, when you're able to maintain those values that you want to see reflected in the society that we're trying to create, it paints a very clear picture of who's on the side of justice, who's on the right side of justice, and who's on the side of injustice. And so it's a really important principle both in our own personal lives as well as in social movements. The 5th principle of Kingian nonviolence is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. Oftentimes in our society, we think of violence as just a physical act. and we fail to recognize that there's twice as many suicides in this country every year as there are homicides. And I would even argue that a lot of those homicides, if not all of them, are ultimately rooted in internal violence. People sometimes say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And it's one of the biggest lies in the world. A lot of times the things that we hear and the things that we take in when we're kids, those scars and those wounds stay with us well into our adulthood. And I think it's really important that we recognize violence as not just a physical act, but it's about how we treat each other, about how we speak to each other. You look at incidents like the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, and all these mass shootings. These shooters were dealing with an incredible amount of internal violence of the spirit. And that manifested in those physical acts of violence. And so if we're only defining violence as a physical act, we're missing out on a lot of the root causes of the violence. Dr. King also said that nonviolence isn't just a refusal to shoot your opponent, it's a refusal to hate your opponent, because holding on to that hate and holding on to that anger is an act of violence that you do to yourself. So committing yourself to nonviolence isn't just refusing to hurt someone physically, but it's refusing to harbor that sort of hate and refusing to harbor that sort of anger, because all that does is it hurts you. It keeps you from being able to move on, and it's an act of violence that you do to yourself. So that internal violence of the spirit is just as important as those physical acts of violence for us to deal with. The sixth and final principle of Kingian nonviolence is that the universe is on the side of justice. This, of course, is another principle that a lot of people struggle with, because there's so much injustice in our society, there's so much violence in our society. People say, well, how can you tell me that the universe is on the side of justice? Dr. King, as a minister, I think had a deep faith in this principle. And not just as a Christian, as a minister, but I think ultimately anyone who's ever been involved in any sort of process for social change has faith in this principle. Otherwise, why would they do it? Everyone who ever participated in the march in the civil rights movement knew that as hard as it is, as difficult as it was, as difficult as their current situation was, that if they kept fighting, that if they kept marching, that ultimately they will win justice. And I think once we lose faith in that, it can lead to a lot of internal violence and a sense of desperation and hopelessness, and that's a very dangerous thing for movements. So I think for anyone involved in social change movements, it's really important for us to continue to have faith in this principle. I also think at the same time that the violence we see in our communities, I've come to believe that the violence in our communities is evidence of this principle. And what I mean by that is, look at all of the investments that we make into violence as a society. Investing in a corrupt police force, investing in broken schools, broken prison systems, unjust economic policies. And then we're somehow surprised that we see violence in our communities. I think we get out of life what we put into life, right? And as a society, if we continue to invest in violence, then the justice of the universe will ensure that the returns that we get on those investments is more violence and injustice. And if we can start to invest more in peace, I believe that the justice in the universe will reward us with those returns, which would be more peace and more justice for communities. So the universe is on the side of justice. It's about what we put in and about the faith that we have in the work that we do. Within the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence, we have what's called the 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence, which is really about how to implement all the principles and all the studies about conflict into a campaign for social change. And the first step is information gathering. Oftentimes when there's an incident of injustice in our communities, a lot of people like to jump right into the protest without gathering the necessary information to really understand the issue. Gathering information about both sides' perspectives on the issue. Gathering information about the history of that conflict and really understanding what that conflict is about and being able to articulate that. Once you have that information, the second step of Kingian nonviolence is education. So you need to educate your community about the information that you found. And specifically, we need to be strategic about identifying the leaders in our communities, whether it's ministers or teachers or community leaders or just people from the block who hold a lot of weight in their community, and educating them so that they can go on to educate their community about the issues of injustice. Once you've educated your community, step number 3 is personal commitment. And that speaks to committing to the long-term process of change. A lot of people don't know that the Montgomery bus boycotts lasted 381 days. And in today's movements, and many of today's movements, we feel like the only commitment that we need to make is to attend a one-day protest. And we really need to be committed to the long term. But also in personal commitment, we talk a lot about how the work for social change it's not easy. And so often it's easy for us to get burnt out, and it's easy for us to get bitter, and we need to find the things that we can do in our own lives and within our own movements that keeps us personally committed to that and keeps our spirits lifted, whether it's singing freedom songs in the civil rights movement or meditating or going for a run or writing poetry. Whatever it is that keeps you personally committed to your goals, we need to identify that and know that that's an important part of building a social movement. The 4th step of Kingian nonviolence is negotiation, and it's the most important aspect of the 6 steps because we believe that negotiation is where conflict is resolved. Conflict is always resolved through dialogue. Now, one of the important things about Kingian negotiation is that we believe that only equals can negotiate, because if one party has more power than the other, then they can just easily say, okay, well, we've heard your concerns and we don't really care. Or they can say, well, you know what, we don't really want to negotiate with you. And when there is that power imbalance, that's when we move into the 5th step of Kingian nonviolence, which is direct action. Now, direct action is oftentimes the only thing we think about when we think of the civil rights movement or any movements. And so much so that oftentimes it gets to a point where it seems like the direct action becomes the goal in and of itself, as opposed to direct action becoming part of a larger organizing strategy that gets you closer to a goal. So within the framework of Kingian nonviolence, direct action is something you use to give yourself leverage so you can go back to the negotiating table as equals. So if someone refuses to negotiate with you, maybe if you sit outside of their office with 1,000 people, that will give you the leverage that you need to open up that door and to be able to have that negotiation in a genuine way. Another reason why we use direct action is to dramatize the issue and to bring the conflicts and the injustices that are prevalent in very isolated communities into the forefront of society. So within the framework of Kingian nonviolence, direct action has a very specific role. The goal of direct action is to always go back to the negotiating table and to try to resolve the conflict there. Now, once you resolve the conflict, the critical and the necessary last step in Kingian nonviolence is reconciliation. Oftentimes, through the course of an organizing campaign, a lot of conflicts come out and feelings are hurt, relationships are damaged, and sometimes when we quote unquote win a campaign, we'll laugh at their face and say, aha, we won the campaign, you all lost. Reconciliation is about bringing those parties who were in conflict together so that they can both recognize that they're both winning, that they both gained something out of the change that they were able to agree on, and to celebrate that victory together. It's not about separating two parties that are in a conflict so they're not throwing fists at each other anymore, but about bringing those parties together and really being able to squash that beef and really being able to reconcile that conflict so that conflict no longer exists.
One of the things that intrigues me about the principles is that it's not linear, that it continues round and round, and you're not finished one step and then go to the next. Rather, you're participating in all of the steps all of the time, and you have to learn how to adjust to that. It is not like you find out facts and then you're done. There's always facts gathering. There's always opportunities to be in dialogue with the people that you are that you think you're in opposition to. because you find out that you're not in opposition, you just have different goals. And how do you achieve those goals? How do you get to those? So it's always been fascinating to me that it's not a linear thing, that one step is accomplished and then you move to the next. You're constantly moving in and out of the steps the entire time. This is a win-win. This is, to use these principles, everybody wins. This is not about, I want to make my point and snuff you out or put you down or put you away, but to really listen to other people's issues and figure out how we can come together, and everybody wins. They get what they need. The whole thing around Kingian nonviolence, I think, is dignity. I really do believe that it's dignity, that everyone is considered and everyone is considered as valuable, and all of creation is considered valuable, and that we respect that. And so that no one loses and no one wins exclusively.
Central Maryland Ecumenical Council, CMEC, invites you to continue this process of learning the practice of nonviolence. CMEC has a number of resources that we have been working with the Baltimore Peace Builders to develop, including trainings, a link to a webinar that CMEC and Baltimore Peace Builders sponsored. Also, there's a link if people are interested in purchasing Kazu Haga's book, Healing Resistance. And finally, a link to our website, CMEC's website, where you can watch the 2 videos and have a listing of the principles and steps of nonviolence. So also we include our email address if you would like to contact us.